Hello, class. We are moving right along now into the 19th century, the 1800s. If the 18th century is a century where people wanted to know everything, it was a search for knowledge and intellect. The 19th century, there's a shift away from that, as you saw with the Sturm und Drang movement, towards a search for wanting to experience everything, to feel everything. Um, I the, the written lecture has some pictures in it that illustrate what I mean by this. But I'm going to play you a couple of pieces of music. One somewhat baroque neoclassic music by Bach, where the music is rather mathematical and methodical. And then a little bit of opening from probably the most famous piece, one of the most famous pieces of romantic music, written by a man named Beethoven, and the opening of his Fifth Symphony, where things seems a little chaotic and wild, and there's dynamics, meaning it gets loud, it gets soft, it gets fast, it gets slow. All right, listen to this for a few seconds, and maybe this can help in your understanding also. Okay, and now to the romantic piece. Just a snippet, just a little bit of it each, okay? So here we go with Ludwig van Beethoven. It's building, it's building. Going back to the first theme. I think you get the picture. I hope you do. My lectures tend to be a little bit haphazard, so I decided to get a little bit organized today. So I wrote some stuff, and if it looks like I'm reading to you, I am. Okay. I will, excuse me, intersperse it with stuff in the meantime. But, you know, Never mind. I thought my border was back there, but it's gone. Okay, 19th century theater. Throughout the 18th century, certain philosophical and artistic ideas evolved that eventually coalesced about the start of the 19th century into the movement known as Romanticism. Okay? Romantic theater, in its purest form, is concentrated on the spiritual, which would allow humankind to transcend the limitations of the physical world and body and find an ideal truth. Subject matter was drawn from nature and natural man. Perhaps one of the best examples of romantic drama is Faust by the German playwright Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Based on the classic legend of the man who sells his soul to the devil, this play depicts humankind's attempt to master all knowledge and power in its constant struggle with the universe. I wrote in the lecture also, that's been my observation that Marlowe's Dr. Faust sold his soul to the devil because he wanted to know everything. Goethe's Faust sells his soul to the devil because he wants to experience everything. He wants to feel everything. He wants to know what it's like to murder somebody, to rape a woman, to rob, and he gets really into it, very devilish, so that his being dragged down to hell at the end, you're almost kind of glad he did. Okay, the Romantics focused on humans and human emotion rather than rationality. They drew their examples from the study of the real world rather than the ideal world, and glorified the idea of the artist as a mad genius unfettered by rules. See, the rules went out the window, the neoclassic rules, pretty much. Victor Hugo wrote a play called Hernani. Well, actually, Hernani is the opera. Hernani with an H. And when it played at the Comédie Française in the 1830s, there were riots in the theater because there was murder on stage. It was a swashbuckling kind of play about it's almost like a Zorro character where this man dresses up as a bandit, but he's really not a bandit. And there were duels on stage and everything. And Hernani caused the Comédie Française to really have some riots in it because this was romantic theater now and not the ideal theater that was founded by the neoclassicists, really. There's always been this battle in theater, which is great. Great fun. Great fun. Romanticism thus gave rise to a vast array of dramatic literature and production that was often undisciplined and that often instituted emotional manipulation for substantial ideas, and it had its roots in the Sturm und Drang, as you know by now, which was the groundwork for the rejection of neoclassicism. Now, the most popular form is melodrama. Okay, the same forces that led to Romanticism also led, in combination with various popular forms, to the development of melodrama, the most pervasive dramatic genre of the 19th century. We still have melodrama with us today. Lots of stuff are melodramatic. Anyway, it conjures up images because it conjures up images of mustache-twirling villains and heroines tied to railroad tracks, and because as literature it is disdained by most critics, melodrama is generally ridiculed or ignored. Yet, it is unquestionably the most popular drama ever produced. It provides a vehicle for spectacular scenic effects and powerful acting. The acting, like, oh, woe is me, all that over-the-top stuff. Oh, look at her, she's beautiful. Oh, gestures become very important. Take a look at that chart that's in the lecture with Delsarte's hand gestures. What do I want to say? Terra. Right? This is his gesture for the hand gestures for terror, the two hands, right? Add that to facial gestures of some sort of terror. Let me take off my glasses for a minute, because the wide eyes are necessary. Like, oh, it's terror. And you shake them a little bit. You'll see a lot of that this weekend because of Halloween. Produces very powerful acting. Sorry, see, this is probably for spectacular effects and powerful acting. and provides the basis for today's popular, although critically disdained, theater and television. The word melodrama has two meanings: a mixture of tragedy and comedy, mixed to drama, and drama accompanied by music. That's its big thing. The later definition can be applied easily to most movie and television productions today, in which characters are identified by themes and audience emotions are manipulated through the music. See, there's a manipulation in there. The stuff that's not on the written page, not the words so much. Melodramas are usually in 3 acts instead of the classical 5. Plots revolve around the conflict between a virtuous protagonist and an evil villain. The hero overcomes a series of seemingly insurmountable difficulties before triumphing. The plots are often contrived, build to a series of climactic moments. They and include many reversals of fate. Major events often include such spectacular elements as floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, horse chases, and battles, all graphically depicted on the stage. They would do a horse race. Well, the chariot race from Ben-Hur would have been done with treadmills built into the stage floor that would wrap around underneath like a long roller, and the horse would be galloping on it. It wouldn't be going anywhere. It would just be like running in place because you're on a treadmill. This is a device put into the stage floor to help with these sorts of spectacular things. So it's a combination of simple plot, clearly delineated characters, strong emotional values, spectacle, and moral tone, where good always conquers evil. That made melodrama enormously popular, creating perhaps the largest audiences in theater history. And in America, the most famous of these melodramas at the time, from the mid 1850s onward, would have been Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, this brings us to something that I didn't write about, but I should talk about a little bit. The 19th century in America and in elsewhere, because of the steamships and railroads, people, and later in the century towards the end, even the automobile, which gets invented at the end of the 19th century, and even motion pictures then too, when people can see in silent films, but they see films. People in the world started to move around a lot, so there was a lot of what we call immigration. It's something that we dealing with today. And in America, many different groups come to America and inform our theater. Musicals are a combination of drama and music. Some people got on boats and came here, and some people were shoved on boats and came here. Jazz, they consider jazz a distinctly American form of music, but it comes from the African Americans that came here. Gospel, jazz, blues, rock and roll, right? All of that is informed by African American rhythms, and sometimes, so there's a lot of that, and it's in the theater too. So the immigration influence of immigrants, and then it happens in other countries too. Through the first quarter of the 19th century, both melodrama and romanticism tended to be somewhat exotic, focusing on historical or extraordinary events while idealizing or oversimplifying characterization. By the 1830s in England, however, the stylistic elements and characteristics of both turned toward contemporary life and domestic matters and seemingly serious thematic concern. Emphasis shifted from spectacle and sensation to the recreation of local color and domestic detail. This required new staging practices that laid the groundwork for much modern stagecraft. The box set came into vogue, a setting depicting 3 walls and a room, with the implication that the audience was observing through an imaginary 4th wall. This was also highly touted by a woman named Madame Vestris. She comes down to as Madame Vestris and her box sets. Um, where an actor manager was getting involved in stagecraft here. Three-dimensional furniture replaced painted representations used previously. Because the sets were no longer mere background, the performance acted as if they were in the real environment of the setting, seemingly unaware of audiences' presence. Well, that's really more towards the end of the century, and it's the beginning of what the next movement in a couple of weeks will be called realism, right? But these things start to overlap. Remember, you just don't wake up and all of a sudden you're in the 21st century. I mean, things still shift. We still are dealing with the 19th century and we're 20 years into the 21st century. Bits of business developed. Instead of assuming a pose and reciting lines, actors created realistic actions appropriate for the character and situation. More and more attention was paid to accuracy and consistency in costume and setting. Playwrights, too, paid more attention to realistic detail. And when we get to the realism, I'll show you how that was even done in a play called A Doll's House by Henry Gibson that I'll talk to you about, or you read about anyway. As plays found a larger audience, economic practices altered. Where once actors were part of a repertory company that might perform dozens of plays in continuous rotation over the course of a season, the long run now became more popular. Actors were hired for a single production to play as many consecutive performances as an audience would pay for. In the written lecture, I wrote to you about Edwin Booth. I spent a little bit more time on him than Mr. Aldrich, who was known in his time as the Black Roscius, by the way. Remember Roscius, the famous Roman actor? But that was Ira and Cushman. But Edwin did Hamlet, his most famous role, and he did it for 100 nights consecutive. Now, 100 nights is a little over 3 months. In today's world, 3 months, you're a flop in 3 months. If you don't play for 30 years, you're a flop. That's not true, but we have stuff on Broadway. Of course, nothing's on Broadway now, but we have stuff on Broadway where fandom is like 32 years, something like that. Anyway, the thing is that Edwin did play consecutively. You would hire people to be in a play, which is what we still do now, So, Edwin also played in melodramas. His other famous melodrama was a play called The Bells, in which he played Cardinal Richelieu. So, in an historical drama that was a melodrama. I often wondered what it would have been like if Charlotte Cushman as Desdemona, Edwin Booth as Iago, and Ira Aldrich as Othello, which was his most famous role, could play together, but they couldn't. They wouldn't have been allowed. Even in New York, which we think is so liberal, in these days was still segregated. Blacks could not play with whites on stage. So it didn't happen until the 1930s or 40s, was it? When Paul Robeson played Othello opposite Uta Hagen, and when they kissed, it caused a big sensation. And this was on Broadway. So, anyway, the French equivalent of the bourgeois drama, which is what that other kind of drama would be called, the of everyday life. Bourgeois is French anyway, but their equivalent to it was the well-made play. It's a form popularized by Eugène Scribe and carried on by his follower Victorien Sardou. Similar to melodrama, the well-made play had a highly crafted formula or structure. It was a structure of cause and effect. Something happens, and then something else happens in reaction to that. A cause and effect kind of play. Not very much episodic because the action continued. although the breaks would come in between scenes, or definitely between acts. Anyway, um, the specifics of each play varied, but the structure of plot outline remained basically the same. A careful exposition, a series of incidents. An exposition is where characters are on stage and they talk about events or people, or that happened before the play begins. The past. In fact, not Doll's House, but what's the one I'm trying to think of? Where the maid and the butler talk a lot about what happened before it happens, and then we meet the rest of the people. It fills the audience in on the backstory as it is, and that's called exposition. Um, so, careful exposition, a series of incidents leading to a climax. The skillful use of dramatic devices such as reversals, hidden information, important props. A letter, for example, falls into the wrong hands and must be retrieved, That contrives suspense. Will the letter get back? Will she get arrested because they found the letter? I mean, this sort of thing. The well-made play formula provided the basis for much of later 19th century theater and drama. And the rest of this thing is about that. So I'm sorry I read that to you, but you know the way I go off on tangents. I don't like going off on tangents too often. It's different in a classroom when you see it, but it must be tedious for you guys. So anyway, the 19th century had all this packed into it. There's a lot there. And that's why I stopped it at 1880. If you look at the syllabus, I say 19th century, not 18th, 19th century from 1800 to 1880, I think I say. So that because it's that last 20 years where we get into realism. We'll talk about that. Next week we talk about the Asian theater. It'll be when we come back. It's the modern theater and then the modern, we only have 3 more of these sessions left. Tomorrow I do want to send you a video also talking a bit about scene design, all the design elements. I have the lecture already written, but I don't want to overburden you today with 2 things coming to at once. I also have checked out all my links to the plays that you should watch on screen for your final paper, which is due December 5. Personally, I would say to you, watch one of the videos the week of Thanksgiving and all of that, and then write your paper and send it on to me that following week on the 5th or before the 5th. Don't sit down and do it now. You have your article paper to write. I've only got 2 from you now, and I need the rest. So, and don't forget to register for maybe some upper level courses. The theater history course, for instance, I mentioned to you. If you want to continue or become a theater minor, you just need 2 upper level 3,000 level courses. And then the capstone, the along the way somewhere, which is FPA 4900. It's the arts in New York City. Anyway, and Saturday night, tonight, don't forget to turn your clocks back an hour. I'm trying to, I'm talking because I'm trying to think, what did I leave out? Did I leave anything out of the 19th century? Probably not. I wanted to talk about immigration. There were other things I could show you if I had the DVD player and we were actually in the classroom, but that's all right. We don't have to worry about that. The list, I'm looking at the list of names here. Like I always said, there are some things that will be in the lecture that are not talked about, but yet they're on the study list. Just Google stuff. Just Google it. All right. I even said about Edwin Booth, it's too much to write about him. If you're interested about him, just go ahead and Google him. He lived in our neighborhood. He lived down on 23rd Street in Irving Place. And his apartment in the building is still there. Well, he had the building. He turned it into the Players Club. In the 19th century, there was a lot of stuff, a lot of men's clubs and stuff. Actors were considered no good, right? So nobody would ask an actor to join their club. So Edwin said, well, screw you. We're going to form our own club. And it was called the Players Club. And it's still there. There's been some other theater clubs, the Lambs Club, for instance, and all, but Edwin founded the Players. And in his own building, and there's a little theater in there and a restaurant. I've been in there. I did some play readings in there. It's a beautiful place, but and lots of portraits all over the place. And on the top floor is his apartment, and it's untouched. It's like a museum. That I have not seen. You have to make a special arrangement with the group to see that, and I just never got to do that. But and there's a statue of him in Gramercy Park as Hamlet. And yes, like I said, he was the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who shot Lincoln. And that sort of destroyed the family for a while. And when the population of the country went crazy and started tar and feathering all actors and shutting down theaters and stuff, Edwin sort of saved the day. He came back on stage after a couple of years, and he just sat there and let the people scream and yell until they started applauding and blah, blah, blah. Because he was the first great homegrown American actor that will go down in history. There's a theater named for him over on 45th Street that I wrote about too. I said that in there. So, Edwin Booth is a little bit of a personal hero of mine, so that's interesting too. The immigration, that's what I wanted to talk about. The Astor Place riots. Charles Macready came from England to do a production on Macbeth. And Edwin Forrest, who was considered an American actor, but he was born in England, Edwin Forrest. And in fact, it's Edwin Forrest that Edwin Booth is named after. Booth's father was an actor. He also was born in London and came to America and all. And so all of the sons and all were born in Maryland here. But Edwin Forrest and Charles Macready both were doing a production of Macbeth at different theaters down on what we call Cooper Union. Astor Place is at Cooper Union, which is 8th Street and Broadway. Not Broadway. 3rd Avenue. Yeah, because the Bowery, 3rd Avenue turns into the Bowery south of that. Cooper Union, the school, is there. And Cooper Union, President Lincoln spoke at Cooper Union. There's plaques all over the place. And on that sort of area where 3 or 4 streets meet, there were theaters there. And because of the Englishmen and because of the Irish immigrants living on the Lower East Side, there was a huge riot that lasted 3 days, and they had to call out the militia, and some people were killed and all. I think when you Google that, that's on your list, and when you Google that, you'll see it. It's depicted in Scorsese's film of Gangs of New York. But the Astor Place riots, I point that out because it's at a time when theater was dangerous. They're rioting over Hernani in the Comédie Française. Later in the 20th century, they will riot at the Abbey Theater over the Playboy of the Western World. Art is dangerous. Art isn't easy, and art is dangerous, and it should be, because art is there to reflect its time and to point people into another direction, perhaps. But that's the philosophy of art, and that's not the point of this class. I'm just looking at this list, and I forgot to mention the Astor Place riots, and I should have. It's also the rise of the Russians. I think you'll see on here something called surf theaters. I'm not sure if it's on the list I'm going to be sending you. It's on this older list. Under Catherine the Great in Russia, a surf theater. Serfs were like our slaves. And they would have the serfs come in and perform theater pieces for the landowners. The way in the southern states, the plantation masters would have the black slaves perform plays and sing and dance and all for their white guests at parties and things. So there were no slave theaters, but there were serf theaters. And other writers like Gogol and Turgenev and Ostrovsky you'll Google these people. Remember, you don't have to look too far into their biographies. Just sort of know who they are, what they did. Okay? Ostrovsky was not a composer, he was a playwright, right? His name is Alexander Ostrovsky, and all. So there's that sort of thing. But you kind of know how this works by now. Um, and it's also the beginning of modern directing with the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen. I'm wondering, is he here? See psychological realism and all that. That's all next week. Oh yeah, Duke. I'm just going to read this to you. He's the father of directing, and I think I had it when we talked about directing. But this is where he comes in, and again, it's around the 1880s. It's in there, maybe a little earlier. The Duke Georg II of Saxe-Meiningen, 1826 to 1914, who presided over the players in his ducal theater in Meiningen, Germany, is generally regarded as the first director. Up until then, the directing of a play was done by the actors. If I was going to be playing, I don't know, say King Claudius in Hamlet, and then Hamlet and I would work out our blocking and all of that. Hamlet, though, in those days would get to be center stage, and he would say his lines, and then he'd look, and then it would be the king's time to talk, and he'd look out at the audience and speak, and all. That's why that kind of acting is not realistic. Yet the settings in the 19th century became more and more realistic with box sets and all of that. But we'll talk about that again next time. His autocratic style was a model for several generations of directors, but then they're going to talk about Andre Antoine, etc. But that's the next time. That's the realism time. So I think I'm finished for this for now, which makes me happy. I just wanted to get something down on screen so that you could, relate to something. Determination. Remember, hand gestures. You will do it. I want you out of here. Disdain. So that's why we laugh at silent movies. If you ever see a silent movie, make a personal choice to go look for 20 minutes at a silent movie. See if you can tell what's going on simply by the pantomime. Right? There were no words until 1927. So just sound come in, and yet movies were invented in the 1890s. So depending upon who you speak with or who scholarship you believe, it was either invented by Edison, Thomas Edison here in the United States, or the Lumiere brothers, les frères Lumière, invented it in France. So in Paris, motion pictures. So thank you for listening again, and I'll be talking to you very soon about stage design precepts, etc. So, but right now, we're going to call it a night. And take care.